Good morning, students. We are from Department of Normal Physiology, and our today's topic is excitability and excitability parameters. And as you can see, here is a lecture plan. First, we will talk about physiological properties of excitable tissue, and excitable tissue, which is a tissue can give response to stimulation by excitement process. And we usually have two tissues, nerve tissues and muscle tissues can uh, be excitable tissue, and they have uh, common two properties, such as excitability and conductivity. So these two properties must exist both these tissues. And again, maybe in the muscle tissue we have a, contractility, and again we have elasticity. Yeah, we will talk about next week. And again we have excitability, its ability, and its ability of, and here we have its definition. So its ability of excitable tissue to give response stimulation by excitement process. So it is ability of excitable tissue. And again, in my word, I will conclude it like this. Excitability, it is the ability of excitable tissue to generate an action potential. And again, here we have its phases, and we have one slide after maybe 1-2 slides. I will talk about it more deeply. And we have parameters. And again, let's see, I already talked about excitability. And again, we have one concept, it's called excitement. Excitement, it's a process. First of all, you must know it's a process. And it's a difficult process of excitable tissue, which is characterized as physiological, biophysical, biochemical, and structural changes in the fibers. So we have during excitement process, we have physiological changes in the fibers in that excitable tissues. We have a biophysical and the biochemical and the structural changes. And again, here we have a parameters of excitability. And first of all, we have a threshold. Threshold, it's a minimum force of an irritant or stimulation which cause excitement, and it's said it's a minimum response of that excitable tissue. And I can say it's said excitability threshold, it is the determined by that tissue. And because why? Because excitable threshold of nerve tissue and or muscle tissue, it's different, because nerve tissue's excitability is different from muscle tissue. And again, here we have a real base. It's a minimum strength of current which can excite the tissue. So and here you must know real base and excitable threshold. The value of two of these are same, exactly same. But real base is describe the current, but threshold is describe the tissues. And if the strength of current reaches one real base strength, the tissue will give a response to that electric stimulation. If it is below than one real base strength, the tissue will not give response to that stimulation. But we have one more situation. It's called summation. If we give stimulation to one excitable tissue, even if it's lower than 1 rheobioic strength, it will give response because its frequency is very quick. When its frequency is very quick, it will give response. It's called summation. And again, we have utilization time. It is the minimum time required for one real basic or threshold strength of stimulus to excite the tissue. And it's a time, you understand, after you give uh, uh, stimulation to one excitable tissue, it will give a response after some time, but we cannot notice it because our eye can see that kind of time because it is millisecond. It's millisecond. And the chronoxia, it is the minimum time required for stimulus with double real basic strength to excite the tissue. So chronoxia, yeah, it is also again time. Utilization time, it's again the time, but chronoxia with double real basic strength, but utilization time is one real basic strength. So you notice chronoxia will be much more kind of quicker than the utilization time or small than utilization time. Again, we have accommodation. Accommodation is adaptation process of excitable tissue to slowly increasing force of an irritant. If we increase the force of an irritant slowly, this tissue cannot recognize the increasing level of that irritation, and it will give same response to those irritation. And again, lability, it is a functional mobility kind of frequency. Again, its lability, it's measured by maximum quantity of impulses which excitable tissue can generate it in 1 unit of time. So here it's correspond to irritation reason. And here we have one table, for example. Sorry for this word, it's called lability. And again, we have absolute repetitive period here. We will talk about it later. And again, the lability of nerve fiber, it is 500 to 1000. And the lability of muscle tissue is 250 to 330. And synapses, especially chemical synapses, it's 100 to 125 impulses per second. So here a nerve fiber can generate impulses in 1 second, much more than muscle and the chemical synapses. And nerve fiber is the most excitable tissue because it can generate up to 1,000 impulses per second, but muscle tissue can only 330 impulses per second. And again, why it is much more, why nerve fiber generate up to 1,000 impulses per second, because it is absolute refractive period is very small. And again, it's 1 to 2 milliseconds, and again and the muscle tissues absolute refractive period is 4 to 5 milliseconds, and again chemical synapse is 8 to 10 milliseconds. And if the absolute refractive period is is short, its lability will be very very high. And according to these 6 parameters, you can determine one excitable tissue's excitability. And again, here we have one curve. It's called strength duration curve, and here the y-axis is called strength of stimulus, and here we have x-axis it's the duration of time. And what we know from this curve is a graph that demonstrates the exact relationship between the strength of stimulus and the duration of stimulus. And here we have variables. So this one is one variables of stimulus, and here if we give impulse, give stimulation with one real basic stimulation, it will give response after this much time. Here it's 1 2 3 4 5 6 0.6 milliseconds, and this time it's required to give response. It's called utilization time. And if we increase the strength of stimulation with double variables, and it's the time required for give response will be shortened, and it's called here it's chronoxia. So chronoxia and the utilization time, chronoxia is much more shorter than utilization time because it is stimulated by two variables each time. And here we have excitable phases during excitement, and here we have usually four phases or four periods. Number one is absolute refractory period, then you have relative refractory period, after that you have a supernormal period, and finally we have a subnormal period. And here the definition of absolute refractory period is given. It said during this period the tissue, it's excitable tissue, you must notice it's excitable tissue, does not show response to any stimulus, whatever strong it is. And kind of during this period, the excitable tissue will not give response to any stimulation. And the duration of this period, it's at 1 to 2 milliseconds, muscle is 2 to 5 milliseconds, and the nerve muscular junction, sometimes we call it myoneural junction, it's one type of synapses, it's 8 to 10 milliseconds. And this time, it will determine the lability of these tissues. And in this diagram, this one will indicate the absolute refractory period. During this time, the excitability of this tissue is zero. And again, relative refractory period. During this period, the tissue only gives responses to a strong irritation, which is above threshold levels. And again, this period in this graph is indicate from here to here and like this. Yeah, all of this is relative refractory period. And during this period, the excitability of this tissue is recovering slowly recovering to 100%. And again, then we have supernormal period. And during this period, tissue responses to irritation, even the irritation strength is below threshold level. And during this period, it's number 3 here, from here to here, it's supernormal period. And during this period, the excitable tissue is hyperactive, very active. And again, subnormal period then comes. After that, the subnormal period is coming. It's the period there is decrease in excitability, and the tissue only responds or only give response to irritations which is above threshold levels. And after that, it will comes to normal situation, normal excitement. And this 4 phases happens during one action potentials, one impulses. And then we have a membrane potential. So membrane potential, we have two potentials. One is called resting membrane potential, one is called action potential. So resting membrane potential is the electric potential differences or voltage differences across the cell membrane, for example, between inside and outside of the cell under resting conditions. Under resting conditions. So during resting conditions, there is unequal distribution of ions between inside and outside of the cell. Station, the sodium is much more than inside the sodium inside the cell, and potassium is here, it's much more than the potassium outside cell. And here during this period, during this resting membrane potential, the outside of membrane is relatively positive charged, and inside of the membrane is relatively negative charged. And here it said value of membrane resting membrane potential for muscle fiber, it's minus 60 to minus 90 microvolt. And here you have some distribution of ions between extracellular and intracellular fluids here. And we said sodium outside of the cell it's 142, and here inside of cell it's 10 millimole per liter. And you notice, and there is unequal distribution of sodium, and sodium wants to go inside the cell, and potassium it's vice opposite. It's here we have much more potassium inside cell, and calcium, it's outside cell we have more calcium. And magnesium is if we have inside the cell we have more magnesium. And again, if sodium channel is opened, if sodium channel is open, because of concentration gradient, the sodium will drive into the cell, or will go inside the cell or influx the cell, and potassium will go outside cell if the potassium channel is opened. And during resting membrane potential, the potassium channel is, we have leakage potassium channels, it's always open. But sodium channel is sometimes it's open, sometimes it's closed. And again, during resting membrane potential, the potassium and the sodium channel is closed. And again, then we have action potential. It's a fluctuation of membrane potential during excitement. And again, here we have diagram of action potentials. And we have action potential phases. We have 5 phases. First one is we have a latent period, then you have a depolarization period, and we can subdivide it into small depolarization period and quick depolarization period, and we have a repolarization period, and we have after depolarization, and we have after hyperpolarization period. And I will came back to resting membrane potentials, and the development of resting membrane potential in excitable tissue is carried out by movement of ions inside and outside of the cell, and which produce ionic imbalance across the cell membrane. It results in the development of more positive outside and more negative inside the cell. And it is produced by 2 factors. Number 1 is because of sodium potassium pump. Number 2 is because of selective permeability of the cell membrane. The latent period. It is the period there is no changes occurs in the electrical potential is applied immediately after the stimulation. So during this period, there is no responses of action excitable tissues. And in this diagram, this one it corresponds to latent period. This one here. And now I'm going to explain the ionic mechanism of action potentials. And here we have a voltage gated sodium channels and voltage gated potassium channels. They are playing important role in the development of action potential. During the onset or start of depolarization, the voltage gated sodium channels open and there is a slow influx of sodium when depolarization reaches to kind of about 10 microvolts. And the voltage gated sodium channels started opening at a faster rate, and it's called sodium channels activation. And when the kind of we will say firing level it's reached to firing level, the influx of sodium channel is very great, and it leads to overshoot. Here this one is from here to here, it's called overshoot, and here it's peak. And then we have sodium channels, we said, but the sodium transport is very short-lived, very short, and sodium channel is closed very immediately. And it's because the rapid inactivation of sodium channels. And thus the sodium channel open and close quickly. At the same time, the potassium channel start opening, and this leads to efflux of potassium out of cell, causing repolarization. And unlike the sodium channel, the potassium channel remain open for longer duration, and these channels remain open for a few more milliseconds after completion repolarization, and it causes efflux of more number of potassium producing efflux of more number of potassium, and it causing hyperpolarization. Um, it becomes more negative inside the cell, and it's cause hyperpolarization. And after that, it will came back to a resting membrane potential. We have the two diagrams. This one is a diagram of action potential, and this one is a diagram of excitabilities. And here you can notice each phases of action potential is corresponding to the relatively some phases of excitability. For example, this period is we call it kind of latent period. It's corresponding to the hyperactive supernormal period of excitability. And then this period is depolarization period. It's corresponding to the this one is absolute repactive period, and this one is repolarization period. It's corresponding to the relative repactive period. And this one, yeah, kind of we call it after depolarization, and sometimes we call it negative after potential, or sometimes we call it negative trace period. It's kind of corresponding to the supernormal period of excitability. And here we have a after hyperpolarization, and it is sometimes we call it positive after potential or positive trace period, because and it is corresponding to the subnormal period of excitability. And that is the end of lecture. Thank you very much. We will see you next week.